Welcome to 10 Minutes On, the podcast where we look behind the headlines and focus on what is actually shifting underneath them. I'm Guy Burton, a former university lecturer and researcher in politics and international relations, and I'm still unable to fully abandon the habit of treating global events as something that requires analysis rather than reaction. And so with that, this week the focus is on the war between Russia and Ukraine. I've covered the conflict before, most recently in February when I looked at the prospects for peace and compared them to other protracted confrontations, like Iran. A few months earlier, I examined the impact of EU sanctions on Russia and the changing nature of warfare, particularly the growing use of drones. This war has become a central reference point for that shift. But this time, I want to address something slightly different: the way the narrative around the war is changing. Over the past few months, there's been a growing assumption in commentary that Ukraine's position is improving, while Russia's is weakening. That framing is now widespread. The problem is that this is also incomplete. What I want to argue in this episode is that the picture is far more uneven. There are signs of Ukrainian resilience and adaptation, certainly, but there is also continued Russian capacity for endurance and escalation. And rather than moving towards resolution, the conflict still contains significant potential for widening rather than narrowing. To borrow a line often attributed to Winston Churchill, we may not be at the beginning of the end, but we may be closer to the end of the beginning. So let me start with some recent developments. Over the past few weeks, Ukraine has intensified long-range drone operations, striking targets deep inside Russian territory, including energy infrastructure linked to Moscow last week. The Ukrainian foreign minister framed this explicitly as an attempt to bring the realities of war closer to the Russian population, to force a reassessment of what the conflict actually means. These strikes followed sustained Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure over the winter period, which have continued the pattern of reciprocal targeting of civilian-linked systems. At roughly the same time, European discussions have included proposals for appointing a special envoy for the conflict, intended to represent EU positions in any future ceasefire or negotiation processes. Those discussions sit alongside the broader question of whether any serious diplomatic track is actually viable at present. Previous American efforts over the past year have produced little durable progress, and negotiations seem stalled. Russia, for its part, has resisted such EU initiatives, arguing that Europe is not an impartial actor, given its political, financial, and military support for Ukraine. That support has also been reinforced by the EU's continued movement towards Ukrainian accession. That process was formally reaffirmed recently, although it remains a long-term project. Full alignment with EU legal and regulatory frameworks will take years, if not longer. And it also raises a political question that is often underplayed: democratic governance during wartime. Ukraine has suspended elections under martial law conditions. That is not surprising in context, but it does mean that the internal political evolution of Ukraine is being shaped under conditions that are structurally non-normal. And that matters for any eventual post-war settlement as well as membership of the European Union. Meanwhile, later this week, the Ukraine Recovery Conference will take place in Gdansk. It brings together Ukrainian officials, EU representatives, and allied governments to discuss reconstruction financing. The scale is already clear. The World Bank estimated earlier this year that Ukraine has suffered around $195 billion in direct physical damage, with total reconstruction costs projected at approximately $588 billion over the next decade. Taken together, these developments point to a deepening institutional relationship between Ukraine and Europe. This has accelerated over time, particularly as European states have taken on a larger share of financial and material support. At the same time, US engagement has become less consistent, creating more pressure on European capacity. There is also a reciprocal dynamic here. Ukraine is not just a recipient of support, it is increasingly positioning itself as a security partner. Its armed forces have undergone rapid adaptation under battlefield conditions, particularly in drone warfare. Both Ukraine and Russia now operate at scale in long-range drone strikes, extending the war well beyond traditional front lines. On the ground, Russian territorial gains have slowed significantly over the past year. Ukraine has not fully reversed earlier losses, but it has stabilized the line of contact and it expanded asymmetric operations, including attacks on Russian naval assets and so-called shadow shipping routes that underpin Russia's oil exports. Russia still controls roughly one-fifth of Ukrainian territory, though, and that figure has not shifted decisively despite sustained military pressure. Ukraine's industrial base has also adapted. Domestic production of ammunition, armored systems, and unmanned platforms has increased substantially. In wartime terms, that matters as much as battlefield movement. There is also a less discussed external dimension here. Following wider escalation in the Middle East earlier this year, including the US-Israel war with Iran and subsequent missile and drone exchanges in the Gulf, several regional states, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait, have reportedly engaged in agreements with President Vladimir Zelensky on Ukrainian drone technology. That reflects a broader diffusion of battlefield innovation into global defense markets. So far, all of this feeds a narrative of Ukrainian momentum and integration with European and wider security networks. But that risks obscuring the Russian side of the equation. First, Russian battlefield performance has not collapsed. It has adapted. The war has been costly and slower than anticipated, but Russia retains significant industrial capacity and manpower mobilization potential. It has also accumulated battlefield experience that most European militaries lack. Second, the war has not generated meaningful domestic political pressure for immediate de-escalation. The Russian state has maintained tight control over media narratives and information flows, combining coercion with sustained propaganda framing that casts the war as defensive and existential. The costs have been managed in ways designed to reduce domestic disruption. Tax increases have been limited, war spending has been absorbed through borrowing and resource reallocation. But the fiscal burden is significant, with estimates suggesting that close to half of federal expenditure is now directly or indirectly linked to the war effort. Manpower has also been structured to avoid full-scale mobilization. Russia has relied on contract recruitment, financial incentives, penal recruitment, and the use of foreign fighters, including reported deployments of North Korean personnel. That approach has so far prevented a politically destabilizing mass conscription model, but it is not cost-free. Casualty levels are rising, and if recruitment no longer matches battlefield losses, the model becomes harder to sustain. Externally, Russia's position has also shifted. Western isolation has not translated into total strategic isolation. Instead, Russia has deepened relationships with several non-Western partners. Iran has provided drone technology, most notably the Shahed systems, which have become central to Russia's strike capability since late 2024. North Korea has also provided manpower support, as I've mentioned. And China has become the most important economic partner, particularly as European energy markets reduce dependence on Russian oil and gas. That relationship is structurally asymmetric, though. Russia is increasingly dependent on Chinese demand, often at discounted prices. That creates a longer-term strategic vulnerability, even if it provides short-term economic stabilization. And this is part of a broader point that's made by Nigel Gould-Davis of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. His argument is that neither Russia nor Europe is fully mobilizing its available resources, while Ukraine is operating at a higher level of relative commitment. On that reading, the war is not a stalemate in the simplest sense. It is an uneven mobilization contest. Similarly, Michael Kimmage of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute has described the conflict as generational in character. The implication is that even a ceasefire would not resolve underlying disputes. Russian claims over Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian demands for full withdrawal and accountability, and the broader unresolved question of Europe's long-term security architecture. The conclusion is uncomfortable but difficult to avoid. Despite periodic claims that the war is moving towards closure, the underlying structure still points towards continuation. Not necessarily in linear escalation, but in cycles of adaptation, limited gains, and renewed pressure. And so in that sense, the most misleading assumption is that the conflict is approaching resolution. The available evidence suggests something closer to prolonged confrontation with the intermittent escalation risks rather than settlement. And that is not a particularly optimistic place to end, but is perhaps a more accurate one. Thank you for listening to 10 Minutes On, and I'll be back again next week with another episode. Have a good week, and goodbye.